Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. Big headlines coming out of COP21 on Thursday. Germany and France declared support for a 1.5 Celsius temperature limit in the climate agreement being negotiated in Paris. The German environmental spokesperson said the 2 degrees Celsius goal was too weak and 1.5 Celsius must be mentioned in a UN treaty. We're now joined by Real News correspondent and board member Dimitri Lascaris, who has been reporting on the ground at COP21 in Paris. Hey, Dimitri.
Hey, Jessica, how you doing?
Good. So, Dimitri, give us the latest. What's the significance of this 1.5 Celsius goal? Is it really big news?
Well, definitely the science underpinning this announcement is sound, which is to say that 2 degrees Celsius is likely too high. At 2 degrees Celsius, we could get up to 20 feet or 6 meters of sea level rise over an extended period of time, albeit an extended period of time, but nonetheless enough sea level rise to cause devastation to coastal regions around the world, and particularly heavily populated coastal regions. That's more than twice as much warming as we've seen thus far, and we're already seeing significantly deleterious effects from climate change around the world. Certain island nations are likely to disappear entirely at 2 degrees Celsius. So there's no question that we should be striving for a temperature increase that does not exceed 1.5 degrees. The French and German governments, to the extent that they are pushing for that, are to be commended. But we shouldn't overestimate the importance of this development, because the language that both the French and German governments are using, first of all, is quite guarded. You mentioned that the German government said that the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius should be mentioned in a treaty. Well, it shouldn't just be mentioned. It should be a legally binding target, and it should be backed up with an enforcement mechanism in an international treaty. And nobody seems to be going there right now, not in the developed world at any rate. And François Hollande, the president of France, used the language, we should have a 1.5 degree Celsius target if possible. And by the way, there are some people within the scientific community who do not think that that is possible at this stage. I've heard one fellow at a press conference who is a scientist himself, but is also here in a journalistic capacity, talk about a scientific analysis which indicates that 1.5 degrees of warming is already baked in. It's just going to take a few more decades for us to achieve it, but it's already baked in because of the greenhouse gases that have already been emitted into the environment. And that if we wanted to stop at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we basically would have to stop emitting CO2 now.
Yeah.
So there's a scientific question about whether it's even possible at this stage.
Dimitri, you're there in the media center now, but as you mentioned, you've been covering press conferences. One press conference in particular I want to talk to you about. The governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, was there with Michael Bloomberg. You were in attendance. Let's take a listen to what the governor of the Bank of England had to say.
Thank you all for taking the time this morning. I think the question you've asked me is, why are we here? And let me explain. We're here because the G20 asked the Financial Stability Board a question in the spring of this year. They asked the question at the prompting of the French government. It's a timely question, as you can appreciate, given where you are today. The question was, what are the implications for the financial sector of climate change? And the issue that the private sector has, whether they're investors in companies or providers of capital credit, the issue is that they don't have the right information to judge how well individual companies are managing that risk, how exposed they are to that risk, and how well they're managing that risk, and where they're going to make progress. So the request from the private sector to the official sector was, can you help us get better information?
So, Dimitri, we just heard Mark Carney speaking there. So isn't this something positive that the business community is thinking green?
Definitely. Mark Carney, to his credit, and I think he's the only central bank governor from a major Western economy who's come out and said this. He has talked about something called the carbon bubble, which is the notion that we cannot burn the vast majority of the reserves of the fossil fuels companies today without wrecking the planet. And the markets are acting as though we can do that. The valuations of fossil fuels companies assume that their reserves can be economically exploited. And he's been saying, look, that's just not reality. And it's time for us to improve disclosure. the companies have to be required to come clean with investors so they have the knowledge they require to make informed investment decisions. Today, what they were doing, Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, were announcing a task force to improve disclosure by fossil fuels companies so investors can appreciate and understand these risks. And it's going to be done within the purview of something called the Financial Accounting Standards Board. That's a U.S. Organization which essentially sets the standards for financial accounting, as its name implies. The problem with this announcement, it sounds good on paper, is that the rules that they're going to be formulating this task force are going to be voluntary. So people, companies will be at liberty to violate them with impunity. And furthermore, they already obliged these companies, like Exxon, which appears to have concealed its knowledge of the climate risks for decades. They're already obliged by law to disclose on a timely basis all material information, including material risks. And the real issue is, why aren't they complying with that obligation? And in particular, why aren't securities regulators and criminal law enforcement prosecuting them for violating the securities laws, which is what they're basically doing with impunity? We don't really need a task force at this stage to formulate voluntary standards. What we need is for the existing law to be enforced vigorously against fossil fuels companies.
I'm glad you mentioned enforcement, because that's a big critique about this COP21, whether or not an enforceable agreement will actually come out of this. So Dimitri, considering you've been observing, attending press conferences, talking to people there on the ground, do you see a substantial agreement coming out of this COP21 summit?
Well, I see an improvement coming. I think everybody, except perhaps the biggest cynics, are anticipating that we are going to see a significant improvement. But we have to remember that the bar has been set very low. There's been one failure after another at these climate conferences to achieve meaningful progress. So we have to sort of remember the context. And what is likely to emerge at this stage, I would say very likely to emerge, is an agreement that's only partially legally binding, principally because of the position of the U.S. government. And by that I mean that the most important part of the agreement, which are the emissions reduction targets, are not going to be legally binding. The parts that are going to be legally binding, it appears, are going to be parts relating to transparency, verification, that countries are complying with their emission reduction targets. But if ultimately countries fail to comply, it appears that this agreement is not going to impose any consequences on those countries for doing that. And what we read and let's bear in mind too, that the emission reduction targets that they've come here with, the major emitters, are not going to keep us even within the 2 degrees Celsius threshold. They're going to result in warming in the range of 2.7 to 3 degrees Celsius. That assumes compliance. So if they don't comply with those, we are basically looking at the planet being rendered largely unlivable. What we really need at the end of the day are much more aggressive targets, and we need the targets to be legally binding and for there to be an effective enforcement mechanism to ensure compliance with those targets.
All right, Dimitri Lascaris joining us from Paris. Thank you so much for the update.
Thank you, Jessica.
You could see more of Dimitri's coverage from Paris right here on The Real News. We'll be bringing you reports from COP21 and analysis from our leading experts. But in order for us to continue this kind of work, we need your help. So be sure to donate to our $200K matching grant campaign so we can keep making The Real News. Thank you for joining us on The Real News Network.